All right, welcome everybody back to the Big Douglas Show. This is another Inside the Command Center podcast where we try to get you as close to the Commanders as we can. To do that today, we've got back on the show my buddy Logan Paulsen. Logan, thank you for doing this today.
Man, thanks for having me back. I know it's been a while, so good to be back on here.
It is. You're a busy man, and listen, we're always grateful for a little bit of time we get to hang out with you. Logan, from the field to the booth to the podcast, what's kind of the difference between the formats? I know a lot of what made you great at both is film studying. Are you doing more film studying now than you were then? How does it compare?
Yeah, I'm probably doing a little bit more now, and people are surprised to hear that. But I think, when you put it in the context of like, I need to watch both sides of the football, I need to prep the next week's opponent. I need, I end up watching between probably two and 4 hours a day, depending on the opponent and what's going on. So it is significant, but I enjoy that stuff. So it's not too crazy. It's just about, making sure I'm still, finding time for the family and doing all that stuff. But I think from the field, that's been the biggest thing, is kind of having to broaden my scope of knowledge and understanding towards some of these other positions, which obviously I didn't have quite as much experience with.
A lot of what they've got you doing on NBC Sports Washington is that kind of breaking down plays. And I know you do it for the Commanders as well. I've seen some of the segments with Santana Moss, and I think most recently with Smoot. You also do one half of the Take Command podcast with Hoffman. What is it that podcasting maybe allows you to do that some of the other mediums don't?
Yeah, so I think, as because you've got a pretty successful podcast in your own right, is, I think it just provides an opportunity to have a longer discussion. When you're doing the TV, it's a 3-minute segment and no one wants to hear you kind of babble on, right? And even when I'm doing the breakdowns, those are about 4 minutes. So if you want to get some like real nuance and real understanding and kind of perspective on a game or on a topic, like a podcasting format, I think, as I think serves the best opportunity for that. So in some ways it's awesome. In some ways it's tough because you talk yourself into corners and stuff you shouldn't say, but it's been a cool learning experience for me. And, I kind of think of myself as a teacher in a weird way. And I think that's one of the reasons I enjoy the podcast stuff, because you get to kind of spend some more time on some topics that you only get to briefly touch on in the show or in the breakdown, whatever it may be.
Let's get to interesting things that you said. Let's get back to the last week of the regular season. News comes out that Hal will be the starter. I think around a lot of the radio formats in different places, you had said that maybe you had heard the people in the building didn't think Hal was ready. Then we get kind of like the Heineke being the greatest guy ever and suggesting to Ron that maybe he shouldn't start at all. I'm not sure that I buy all of that. Maybe it was more like Marty saying, hey, I scouted Hal and we drafted Hal, and I'd like to see Hal play. Take us back to that last week and kind of how we went from not starting Hal to Hal not being ready to eventually Hal playing and looking pretty good.
Yeah, so I think it's important for me just to acknowledge that when I watch practice, I'm watching more for like general themes, like general scheme things, kind of how they're thinking about attacking the opposing defense, what they're expecting from that defense. That's kind of my focus. So I'm not super dialed in necessarily on how individuals are playing in practice. It's more kind of broad strokes. And I think, like when I do watch practice, or when I did watch practice, obviously Sam Howell does jump out at you. But I think it's in practice, it can be really challenging to tell kind of where a player's at. And so I think, leading that last week, I think there was this big push for Sam Howell. And I think really my main goal in saying what I said was just to kind of temper expectations, quite frankly. Like that, I think there was this expectation he was going to come in and save the season. They were going to beat Dallas and it was going to be crazy. But, he's a 5th-round pick for a reason. And he had some limitations coming out in the draft. And I just, wanted to give him an opportunity to kind of put his best foot forward, sans expectations, so to speak. So I think that's part of it. And I do think, obviously people like Sam in the building. And I think a lot of that's come out since he played really well. Players and coaches have alluded to how much they've liked him throughout the process. But, depending on how much I like a guy does not mean I think he's ready to start or whatever it may be. Right. So there is a line there. There's kind of some nuance there that I think needs to be acknowledged. So I do think that, Sam's well liked as far as I can tell. People are excited about what he can do. But does that mean he's ready to be the face of the franchise? I don't have a great answer to that, but the history I've had in the NFL would probably say no. He needs some more time to develop. And I think just making sure people understood that and understood the context of him and some of his limitations coming into the season, and coming into that game, I think we're just important to acknowledge, really.
So just for clarity, when the news, when your comments came out, that was not that somebody in the building had told you Sam Howell wasn't ready.
No,
that was just you being around, taking a look, and tempering expectations. Because I think a lot of people took from what you said that people inside the building, because you've got people that you know in there, had told you that Sam wasn't ready, and that's not what you're saying. You were just trying to temper expectations.
Yeah, and I think honestly, depending on who you talk to, you might get a different thing. Some people might say, "Oh, Sam's totally ready," or "Sam, we still want to see X, Y, Z from Sam," and that does not detract from what they think of Sam as a person or his potential as a player. Just there were different perspectives on his level of readiness, and again, like I didn't talk to any of those people before the fact, partially because I didn't want to sway my own. I also don't want to get myself in trouble and say something I shouldn't say, So, but I do think like that's part of it. And that's totally understandable. Like when you're looking at draft evaluations and draft profiles and player comps and all those different things, people have different perspectives. And I think there was a little bit of that going on with Sam. And like I said, like I watched Sam, but I didn't study Sam to see if he was ready. And I also just kind of went back to my evaluation of him in college and what he did in the preseason and said, these are some things that he needs to get corrected. And it's really hard to tell if he's gotten those things corrected in practice anyway. And I would be just nervous if I'm the head coach starting a young guy about these possible things. So yeah, I think that's a really nice way to put it. That's my perspective about some reservations I had in terms of tempering expectations. And obviously he did a great job, and I'm really happy that he did a great job because that bodes well for the organization. It bodes well for Sam, which is ultimately what I'm rooting for each and every time I watch a game.
Sorry, I'm coughing. I've got this cold I've been working through. Is it hard to be critical, like on your podcast, of the staff, and then have to go and do like a hit with Ron Rivera, let's say? Like how does that work?
That's very challenging because as a player, I was always very very reluctant to criticize because I know how hard things are. And one of the things of when I was playing that really stood out to me was just how kind of brutal the media can be towards people. And I think people forget that they are human beings with families and, limitations and
not video game players.
Yeah, right. And adversities going on in their own lives. So I always try to temper that. And, I always try to remember that I'm going to see that person the next day. Like if someone asked me about you and I were to say something mean about you, not that I would have anything mean about you to say, but it would be weird. I'd feel weird coming back and talking to your face. Right. So I always try to make sure I do a good job of catching what I say about the staff in a way that I would like to be talked about. Even if I'm not doing a good job, I don't want someone to come out and say I should be fired. I think there's a level of nuance to everything they do and a level of adversity that they have that it's important for fans to understand. And I always try to bring that up. And I always try to remember the relationships I have. And those are more important than any kind of flashy soundbite that I can deliver in the moment.
We'll get to some of the coordinator stuff here in a minute. But as I was thinking back on the season, to me, part of what the staff doesn't do well is kind of that in-game feel for how things are going. And I've always said, and maybe you see it differently, but every staff should have somebody on it that watches games from beginning to end, kind of like a fan does on the couch on a Sunday, right? Because I think a lot of the casual fans don't realize that you guys, coaches, when you get the all 22 film, you're literally watching cut-ups of plays to see if they worked, if they didn't work, why they didn't work, how do we get to this from this play to the next play. There's no time stamp on the bottom, so you have no real idea of in-game flow. Am I crazy there, or should more staffs be leaning on people that watch full games and get a better vibe for what's going on during the flow of a game?
I definitely, I'm not super privy to what this staff does in their process. Obviously, I do talk to Ron, I do talk to people around the building, but in terms of their meeting structure, I'm going to speak on stuff that I was exposed to in the past. And one of the things that does happen is like you'll sit down for the offensive meeting to review the film, and you'll be like, oh, this should have been a touchdown, this should have been a first down, and you kind of get in this mode of like the play is designed in this way, and if it's executed, the goal should be achieved. And I think there is this kind of element of groupthink that you get into as a team and as an offensive as player and as an offensive staff specifically, that kind of lends you say, man, like, yeah, what we're doing is good. What we're doing is really good. And I do think that there is an advantage to have somebody just bring a different perspective. And I think that's true of everything, right? That's true of life. Just someone who can kind of say, hey, have you thought about this? Like one of the most advantageous things at the office is I work with a whole bunch of people who have been longtime fans of the team, and they'll be saying like, why don't we do this? Like, why don't we do XYZ? And I'll be like, you know what? I haven't really thought about it because football convention is such that that's kind of off the table to start. So just to kind of stimulate that thought and get somebody who's not totally bought into the message, because that's in a way that's what makes a good team is people are all kind of on the same page and united in their perspective. But also it's good to have someone say, hey, have we thought about maybe doing this on third down? Have we thought about maybe bringing this formation into the fold? And I think there is a merit to that is undeniable. And I think some staffs do that. They have independent contractors and evaluators that come in and kind of oversee the offense and say, oh, you're getting away from what you're really good at here. Why are you doing that? And I think that voice and that perspective can be and is very advantageous. With regards to the film specifically, you do have time stamps on it, but you can kind of lose yourself in the film, so I definitely agree with that. And I think it would be good to have somebody again, you want someone with a coaching background as opposed to a fan background, but someone who can say, hey, like why XYZ, why this, what's the point of this play? And I think that's a very astute observation that I think that any staff could benefit from.
Turner's out now. I always kind of was higher, I think, on Turner than a lot of maybe the rest of the fan base was. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like the reason Turner wasn't more successful, one, that they never got the quarterback situation. So,
sure.
And that's not fair. But I think just as far as like what he could learn from this gig, taking to his next gig is he wasn't very good at layering plays. If that makes sense. Like I liked some of the plays, but I'm not sure that we had a roadmap to get to where we were going. Does that make sense? I mean,
yeah.
Some of the plays I just didn't feel like, again, the in-game flow, building off one play to the next. To me, that's where he lacked a bit.
Yeah, and I think this is a complicated thing for me to talk about because of the connection to the team. But I agree. I do think that stacking plays and kind of just having a coherent offensive vision is something that I think if I was going to tell Scott to his face, if he were to ask me, hey, what could I have done better? That would be probably priority number one for me to bring up. Just because I think you got Ron and Marty and some other people on the staff kind of saying we want to be a run-first team. And you could tell at times during the season, Scott wanted to be kind of a drop-back passing emphasis offense. And I think that dichotomy of thought in the building was something that, again, made it probably very challenging for Scott to have a coherent vision and execute the offense the way he wanted it to. And I think it also kind of made it challenging for him to stack plays the way that, I'm familiar with coming from like that West Coast Kyle Shanahan offense, where it's you run out of these formations, you also pass out of these formations, you don't give these tells, and you run this play to see if they're going to see how the defense is going to play versus this front, and you kind of stack and move forward. And I think, again, that's something that, at least to my eye, I didn't observe from Scott. And Scott, I never got to talk to Scott specifically about football. We talked about, his kids. We talked about weightlifting. He enjoys weightlifting quite a bit, but he kept all that stuff and his process very close to the vest. So he might have had something that was very clear in terms of his process that I was not privy to. But I do think just from an observational standpoint, I'd be like, layering plays is probably one thing that should have been emphasized or prioritized or maybe worked on a little bit more during his tenure here.
Do you think the plan changed at some point during the season to this? run heavy
Mm.
approach based on how it was going, because the draft, I mean, taking another wide receiver in the first round doesn't necessarily point out we're going to be a run first, run heavy team. Do you think that, like, once Carson got hurt, or once maybe they didn't feel like Carson was doing the things they were hoping to, did they have to pivot during the season, or do you think the plan was to always be run heavy, at least in Ron's mind?
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly, because there are, people you talk to, in August of last season, they said that was on the table, a run first offense, right? And then you kind of say, well, they drafted a receiver. I don't think that necessarily precludes them from being a run first team. I think you want as many offensive weapons as you can. I think this fan base is very familiar with the idea that, once Curtis got hurt last year, they were in a similar spot with Terry being the only receiver. And I think you just need offensive playmakers. Look at San Francisco. They are they're a team that's kind of built around this run first approach. And they have Deebo Samuel, they have George Kittle, they have Ayuk, they have Christian McCaffrey. Like, they have playmakers, they have weapons. And I think you want to cultivate an offense around those playmakers and people that can make plays. So I don't think that necessarily informs a shift. I think the bigger kind of shift in my mind comes from when you look at week 1 and week 2 and week 3, where you're playing the Eagles, you're playing Detroit, you're playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, where it is a more drop back heavy emphasis. And that seems to be who you want to be. And that's like the conversation of the offseason, is using Carson's arm to push the football down the field, to kind of saying after that first Philadelphia game, hey, maybe we need to reevaluate something. And I think that's okay too. I think when you look at the personnel they had accrued, Brian Robinson, Antonio Gibson, Andrew Noel is very prolific in the run game. Trey Turner is a better run blocker than a pass protector. Let's lean into those guys' skill set. Let's insulate this group a little bit, and then let's let defenses win football games. I think that's the thing that to me denotes a shift, not necessarily the drafting. It just seemed like there was an emphasis in play calling that transitioned after that tough outing against the Eagles. And so maybe there was a shift there, but maybe there was kind of friction, conflicting ideas in the building. I don't know that for sure, but maybe there was something like that. People saying we want to be run first, and Scott has his own vision. But I do think eventually they settled on something that spoke to this offense's skill set and what they did really well. And I think that is, ultimately something that I think they can look at and say, oh, this is who we want to be, and take that into 2024.
Explain to the listeners a little bit. Ron comes out with this 2-to-1 run ratio that he soon walks back a little bit. I think people hear we want to be run first, and you're looking at 40 carries, and you're back to this archaic 17-13 style of football. That's not really the deal. I mean, there are a lot of prolific offenses right now. You mentioned San Francisco that wants to be run first, but that doesn't mean that they're not trying to be the first to 40, which is kind of feels like where the NFL is headed.
Sure. And I think so. There's a number of teams, right? The Green Bay Packers are like that. The Minnesota
Absolutely.
Vikings are like that. The Atlanta Falcons, the Tennessee Titans, they all kind of abide by this principle of saying we will run the football out of these kind of mirrored formations. So with like 2 tight ends or a tight end and a fullback, to get the defense to match in base defense, right? Which is your 3 linebackers, 4 defensive linemen, or whatever your base defensive end is. Bring that safety into the box, play that cover 3 structure. And if you've allocated more resources to stopping the run, the throwing lanes in the back end are more open. And because you're efficient at running the football, when you run play action pass, the linebackers step up, they fit blocks, and also it makes it easier for the O-line to pass protect, which allows you to kind of insulate your offensive line, insulate your worst pass protectors, your tight ends and your backs, because the defense thinks it's run, and you can push the football down the field. And if you look at San Francisco, because we played them this year, a lot of their big chunk plays, the one to Ayuk, for example, comes off of a play action pass. And so you get a nice clean pocket off of that, and you get a good route runner in a one-on-one situation because you have allocated more resources to stopping the run. And I think understanding what the run game and what that relationship and what that layering does for you, it allows you to manufacture explosive plays. Like San Francisco is the extreme of this example, but they have the most open receivers in the NFL per target, right? So the most space on completion. And a lot of that is, again, Kyle does a great job scheming stuff up, but it's because he does a great job scheming that up and putting the defense in conflict, saying, do I need to fit this run, or do I need to cover the receiver I'm supposed to be guarding? And so that relationship is something that I think is what fans need to be focusing on when they hear that ratio. And obviously he misspoke with that. It's really 1-to-1 is probably the most extreme you would get. Like, for example, Atlanta this year was around 60. I think they were 58% in terms of called runs. And that's a very high number. But if you look at the 49ers, for example, they're in the 45 to 48 range. Last year, Green Bay, who had a great offense, they were I think they were 49, which is one of the highest in the NFL. So that's kind of the ratio you're talking about. And then if you are ahead, I think this is another thing that might inform that 2-to-1 number a little bit more, is if you are ahead, you're going to be in your 4-minute offense and you're going to be running the football a lot more. The back's going to get more touches. So I think that may be what they were getting at. But the core tenet of that comment, I think, is true. I think it's not this archaic thing. It's like what good offenses in the NFL are doing and how do the Commanders execute that same principle with a new coordinator, with good running backs, and with young, talented skill position players.
Okay, new coordinators in. If they came to you and said, Logan, what should we be looking at, for a new coordinator, what would you suggest to them based on the personnel that we currently have?
Right. I think you want someone who has a familiarity with this kind of layering, as you worded it, this layering of plays. And you look at, the guy from Miami, for example, what's his name? Studesville. Yeah, thank you. Like, he has an experience with that because Mike McDaniels did that same offense or a version of that offense when he was in San Francisco, right? Darrell Bevell did a lot of that when he was in Seattle between 2011 and 2017. Charles London is a guy that I think is interesting because he is from Atlanta and they have this run first, play action, pass heavy system that I think would fit perfectly with what Ron wants to be, but he's never called plays before. So I kind of back up off of that a little bit. And so those are the types of names that I think are very compelling in this conversation. Do I think those guys will get hired? Probably not. But I think those are the names that I would be looking for. Someone who's got experience, again, with the layering element, marrying those runs and those passes together to help you manufacture those big plays, I think is what I would be looking for if I'm the head coach of the Commanders.
Benjamin Albright was on this show Wednesday and is fairly tuned in. He told me he had heard a rumor that Eric Bieniemy may be interested in the job and that the Commanders may be interested in him. It would give Eric an opportunity to be the obvious play caller. I mean, even if Andy's in Kansas City telling everybody that Eric's calling the plays, there'll be a lot of people that don't believe that Eric's calling the plays. What do you think about a guy like that?
I think that's very compelling. I think it's more, in a way, it's more realistic than people want to give it credit for. I think it's going to happen? No, because I think it's going to be hard to leave Kansas City with all that tout. But Ron has an excellent relationship with Andy Reid, and if Andy Reid were to go to bat for Eric Bieniemy, I think that would be absolutely outstanding, and that would be enough of an endorsement from someone that Ron trusts to get him in here. And I do think Bieniemy is a very seemingly creative person, and I think he does a fantastic job with that offense. So that would be great to have that here. I do think it's important to understand that this is a little different situation than that. And one of the main things I would call attention to is the strength of that team. A lot of people think is obviously Patrick Mahomes and the skill position players, but they have the second-rated offensive line in the NFL behind the Philadelphia Eagles. So one of the things that allows you to execute a great offense is having a competent to a great offensive line. Like the Eagles are a great example. Obviously, Kansas City Chiefs are a great example. And if you look at offenses in this playoff sphere that are going to struggle a little bit, you look at Cincinnati, their offensive line's really banged up. Their tackle gets hurt. It really inhibits what you can do from a passing game standpoint and from a creativity standpoint. So whoever the OC is, they're going to need to find a way to kind of address that position to make sure they can execute the offense the way that they want to execute it.
I've got to claim ignorance here. Does the offensive coordinator generally get to bring a staff with him?
They do, yeah.
To replace Ken Zampese if he doesn't like him? Does he replace the offensive line coach, Madsko, if he doesn't like him? How does that generally work?
So I think that's one of the things about this job that is kind of yet to be seen with regards to what the OC will and will not be able to do. So traditionally, a GM or an owner can retain certain coaches that they think are very talented in a coaching holdover. So a good example of that is when Jay Gruden comes in, he wants to retain Sean McVay because he thinks he's very, very talented. He's worked with Sean before, but the whole staff outside of him is overhauled for the most part, right? So I think in this case, Ron hasn't said anything and the staff hasn't said anything. But if I'm an OC, I want to be able to bring in some of my own pieces. So of the staff that exists now, who are the flexible pieces? Who are the pieces that I feel comfortable parting with if I am to get a new offensive coordinator? And because as much as we want to say that the system will remain largely the same, and that's why a guy like Pat Shurmur is very appetizing, I think, for this job because he knows Ron. He's run a version of this offense before. He's worked with some of these guys on staff before. So maybe there wouldn't be this crazy staff overhaul that comes with a guy like Stoodsville, where he wants to run a different offense and you need to get your generals in there to get that executed. So I think that's something that is a little bit up in the air at the moment. We haven't heard anything about it with regards to who will stay and who will go if there were a new coach to come in. But usually, and a long-winded answer to your question, the coordinator gets to bring in a lot of their own staff. So that's something else to kind of keep an eye on. Like the longer this process goes, like, are you giving them enough time to hire a staff, and
Right.
Are they going to be able to hire the people that they want?
Joe House was going to join us from the Ringer today. He couldn't make it with the scheduling, but he wanted one of his questions for you was going to be, who do you think will be the opening day starter at quarterback next season?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. I mean, obviously there is this kind of prevailing notion from fans, from the coaching staff, from the media here that Sam Howell is going to get a good look this offseason. And so if I was going to say he'd have good money, good odds right now to be the starter next year, but I do think his development's going to play a really pivotal role in that. So, if you choose to re-sign Taylor Heineke, if you choose to go out and sign a guy like Jacoby Brissett, is that veteran mentor player going to start the first 3 games while Sam is still getting his feet wet and still kind of understanding the offense? Or does Sam get to be the day one guy? I think that's really the crux of the question. But I would probably put my money on Sam to be the day one starter next year, barring any crazy news or offseason notes.
Does Heineke, does the legend of Heineke loom too large to have him in the quarterback room? Is that unfair to say? I mean, is that
No.
more of a fan thing, or is that a realistic thing?
I think that is a real thing. And you say, is it a fan thing? I think it is a thing because of the fans, right? Because of their relationship with him and their belief in him. So I do think that that's something that I think will be an interesting decision this offseason. And from what I understand, Sam and Taylor have a great relationship, and Taylor would be willing to support Sam in whatever capacity this coaching staff deems appropriate, which is great. And that's what we heard, when Ron went and talked to him about whether or not Sam should be the starter, right? Taylor just seems to be very supportive of Sam. But I do think with Sam Howell, if Sam Howell is the starter, fans will be a little bit more patient as opposed to how they were with Carson Wentz, right? I think there is they're excited about Sam. I think they'd give Sam a longer leash. So I don't think that. I think it is significant, and I think it's something that should be factored in. But I think if you were kind of squinting and looking at it in a very specific way, you could say to yourself that, hey, the fans like Sam a lot more than they like Carson, for example, and therefore they'll be a little bit slower to call for Taylor.
I'd like to get your thoughts on the games this weekend. Before we do, let's just run through some quick hitters here and hear what you have to say. Logan Thomas looked like he missed a step this year. Is he getting old, or do you think he just needed more time from recovery? There's lots of there's fairly big cap savings to let Logan go. Do you think he's worth bringing back?
I think Logan's a fantastic football player. I think he's physical. Too. I think he's big. I think he can catch the football well. I think the usage package this year for him is one of the things that really hurt him. I also think the youth in the room is something else that might hurt him. Obviously, Armani Rogers and Cole Turner, John Bates had all outstanding years. And then there's Curtis Hodges, who is a guy that they kept on IR when they
was your favorite of the group, right?
Yeah. I do like watching him quite a bit. So Those three guys, I think, might be more telling than anything for Logan, who I think, again, deserves to be playing in the NFL, probably deserves the money he's going to be making. But I think this situation with those young players makes losing him, as much as it hurts me to say this because I like Logan a lot,
Yeah.
makes it a little bit more viable.
What's the plan at center for next year?
I think you got to do some homework. I think, Wes Schweitzer is a guy that did a great job in his opportunities. Obviously, there was some issues at moments with the snaps, but I think when you look at his season and his body of work, you say that guy elevated and did a great job playing center for this team. Tyler Larson's obviously another guy who did a great job playing center. You just, it's so funny. You spend a lot of time with the team, but you don't realize how good of football players they are until they're on the field in
Right.
game reps. And he's been kind of up and down for a while now with injuries, but when he did play, he did a great job. So is he going to be coming back? I know the knee injury was pretty significant. So what's his timetable? I think that informs what you're doing. And then obviously the draft is coming up, and I think you need to probably draft two guys for sure, whether that's a tackle and a guard or a tackle and a center. I think that remains to be seen, but probably part of this evaluation with them. And then the free agency center market is something I would also kind of sniff around at just to see who's available.
Jamin took a big step this year, but I still don't know that they want him or that he should be playing middle. Would you bring Holcomb back?
Yeah, I think I'd give it a good look, and it's just crazy how much better Jamin played this year. Like
Really?
he played so much better,
Yeah.
and watching him on a down-to-down basis, you're like, man, I'd like to see him on the field more. And the way to do that is to have him play Mike. And usually you can find guys who can play Will. I think it still remains to be seen whether he can play Mike full time. He did have the green dot for some games this year. Cole's a heck of a football player, and I know they like him a ton. But I think Jamin's development is the key factor there. He got so much better, so and I think with the safeties playing the way they are, Cam can basically be your will linebacker in certain looks. Sure. I think it devalues Cole a little bit. So obviously, if the price is right, get Cole back in here immediately because I think the guys love him. He's a smart football player, but is he necessary? I think becomes the question. And because of the development at safety of Forrest and Percy in the last game, Bobby McCain playing the nickel spot, can you get around it if Jamin is ready to take that Mike role? Probably, which, as much as I like Cole, like that's one of the hard facts of the NFL.
That was my next. You brought it up, but it feels like they've finally gotten the safety position figured out for what feels like they've been trying to do it for a decade almost.
Yeah.
Feel like they got it. And to your point, Percy did look just in one game, but he was flying around looking good. And you can tell how much better the group got once they were finally able to get McCain into the slot, right?
Yeah, and I think the most definitive thing that came out about the safety class, the safety group this year, is they've got two young guys who are very athletic and very good football players. In Percy, with all he did on special teams in the last game, and then Forrest for how he played this year. He played great this year. But I think the biggest thing is Cam Curl and how he plays so many different roles in that defense and how it's really hard to replace him. So, does Percy's development allow you to replace him? I think that becomes a big question because if not, I think you need to find maybe someone who's got more of that chess piece approach that can kind of step in certain situations. So that's something I think I totally agree with you. I think the safety group is one of the strengths of the team now, but do you need another piece just in case Cam gets hurt because this defense does take a pretty dramatic step backwards when he's not out there?
Better chance that they'll get a long-term deal done for Daron Payne or he'll be back on the franchise tag. Because I can't see him letting him walk out of the building for the comp pit. I mean, that seems crazy.
Right. And I think so. This is something I've kicked around. And again, this is just me playing, GM at home, is I would probably tag him and then I'd look to trade him. And that's not an indictment of Payne. I think Payne is fantastic. I would love to have him here. I just think his value right now has got to be so high. Like we're talking like a first and a third this year. And for a team that has a lot of holes and has a lot of needs, maybe that's the way to go. John Ridgway did a great job kind of as a role player. He drafted Big Phil last year in the second round. Again, he's coming off an injury, but you do have some flexibility on the defensive line that you didn't have before. Some kind of sneaky depth pieces. So do you try to trade him? I think that's something that I would really look hard at if the number is really catastrophically high, which I think there's a potential that it might be, because literally he's a top 3 defensive tackle this year. So he's going to want to get paid like the top guy.
And the number looks like 22 million.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a big number when the cap's only 18. So
right.
Why aren't we at a point where every playing surface is exactly the same?
Yeah. I don't know. That's a good question.
Why is that a bigger deal?
That's something that's well out of my pay grade.
And pay is probably what the problem is.
Yeah, I think
it's gotta be money.
I think it has a lot to do with what these stadiums are used for. They're not all. It's not all football games. It's concerts. It's other things like that. So the turf holds up a little bit better in those different environments, I would guess. And I think, you look at teams like Arizona with the retractable field where they can go between different surfaces kind of at the drop of a hat. Like the weather situation here in Washington is not super favorable to that, I would imagine, in terms of having like the grass grow outside in the winter. It's not going to work as well. But I think that's probably a big feature of it, is just these stadiums are used for soccer, football, monster truck rallies, and I think the artificial surface holds up a little bit better.
All right, let's run through the games this weekend real quick. Jacksonville at the Chiefs. It's an 8.5-point spread. You like them to cover that number?
I don't know if I like them to cover. I love the I love the Jags this year. I love them. Yeah. I love to see Trevor Lawrence playing like he's playing. The prince that was promised is I love that quote. Whoever made that up. Yeah. It's just one of those things. Like, I like to see good players play well, and I like to see that young defense playing well for them. But Kansas City is a different animal, man. Like that's the best team in football probably. And do they make it competitive? Maybe, but gosh, Kansas City's had 2 weeks to prep for them. It's going to be tough. So I'm taking Kansas City, and I think Kansas City, covers that.
Jacksonville's going to get Calvin Ridley next year too. Like that.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy. Yep, it's crazy.
I find this game to be interesting. Giants at Philly. The spread 7.5. That's a big number. I like Giants' style of play to be able to stay in this. Do you?
I do, and I think depending on game flow, I think if the Giants are close through a quarter, I think they cover that. And I know that doesn't help people who are making bets, but if you look at the first New York Philly game that they played, the game flow got a little wonky. They had a turnover on downs. Philly had to go for it on 4th down. You know what I mean? They had a big punt return, and all of a sudden it was like within the span of like 2 minutes, it was 21-7. And the Giants just aren't equipped to overcome that kind of score differential. So if they can keep it tight, I mean, I said this before on my podcast, but the staffs for the Giants is the variable here. Mike Kafka, Dayball, Wink Martindale, those guys each week just bring something really unique and special, and just understand the opponent that they're playing at such a high level. And I go to myself, if those guys come out with something cool, they cover the 7. If they don't, it's going to be probably a 14-point Philadelphia win.
They're going to have to pay Daniel Jones $40 million, right? I mean,
they are.
He made a lot of money this year.
Yeah, 40. It'll be interesting to see if it's 40. I mean, that seems to be the market price at the moment. But yeah, I mean, he's played that well, so good for him.
Jay Gruden was a big Daniel Jones guy, right?
Was he? I don't know. I don't remember that.
Cincinnati at Buffalo. This is one of the closer spreads at 5.5.
Yeah. I think the big thing here is the O-line for Cincinnati.
Cincinnati hasn't lost since Halloween.
That's true, but I think the O-line is banged up. Their left tackle got hurt in the last game. They're starting a guy who I like coming out, but is a little bit underdeveloped technically. And, everyone talks about Buffalo's offense, but that defensive line, even without Von Miller, is a bunch of pretty good pass rushers. And they can make this a long day. And I do think you will say, they got Joe Mixon, but they haven't run the ball very well. So it's like, can they balance this banged up offensive line with their excellent receiver talent? Joe Burrow's obviously probably top 2-3 quarterback in the NFL at the moment. So that's always on the table, but I don't know. I think the Bills roster is better. It'll just be interesting to see whether Josh Allen cannot turn the football over for an extended period of time, because that's not something he's been able to do for the last probably 8 weeks. So
incredible to still see Samaje Perine playing football.
Yeah, and he's playing well.
Like he's been forever. And finally, Dallas is at San Francisco. This is the tightest line, but I don't know. I think San Francisco wins this pretty easily. What are your thoughts here on the last game of the weekend?
Yeah, I like San Francisco, and it's not necessarily Kyle Shanahan is the play caller. It's that defense for San Francisco against Dallas. It's tough, and we saw kind of what Dak looks like against a good defense here in Washington, and if he's off, it's going to be a long day for them. They're not going to let him run the football. A lot's going to be on Dak's shoulders, and I think it's going to allow Kyle to call a conservative game and kind of pick his spots and get those big shot chunk plays. And it might be a 7-point game. I don't know. It's tough to say, but I think San Francisco wins.
How incredible is it that Trent Williams is still the best left tackle in football? And I'd suggest he's like, compared to whoever's second, like to me, he's got the biggest gap, right? Like if
I think like last year for sure, he was the most dominant player in football, probably in the last 20 years. This year, a little bit of a step back, but still he's better than everybody else. And it's you're right. It's not even close from an athletic standpoint. I think guys like Trent Brown, Tristan Wirfs, Lane Johnson are guys that I think are interesting in terms of conversation with regards to close to Trent. But I'm always going to take Trent because that's my guy. So
no doubt. Logan, you're the best, man. I appreciate the time today. It took too long, but it was well worth it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, man. It was good we got to catch up.
All right, thanks, buddy.
Yeah.